Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's AIM webinar. It's lovely to talk to you. Hopefully, there'll be a few more folks join as we get going. So, welcome. My name is James Colborn. I'm going to be your host today. I do many of these webinars on behalf of AIM and aimshop.com here in the UK. So that's fantastic. Very pleased to be here. Now, interesting topic, one that is something that I've been sort of eagerly waiting to be able to work with, but interestingly have struggled a bit because I've never raced the same car in real life as I have done in simulator. And so today's conversation is going to focus on a little bit about simulator racing, a little bit about analyzing simulator racing data, and then how to set up the AIM Race Studio 3 analysis software to be able to compare the same car, the same driver, the same track, but in one instance, one is in real life and one is on a simulator. How close can they be? Do I drive differently on each of them? Do you drive differently? Those sort of things. So that's going to be the key aspect and conversation for today. Now, a few housekeeping things before we get going. The first is, if you wouldn't mind all staying on mute, that'd be great, just in case somebody brings you a cup of tea or you have a quick chat or the phone rings, just so it doesn't sort of affect the conversation. Feel free to ask questions in the chat box. I may get to them while we're presenting. If not, rest assured, we'll get to them as we end and get through to the end of today's presentation. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation. So I think more than anything else, we should sort of cover off on what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to start off with the basics of downloading data from a simulator. Now, many of you may be saying, well, hold on a second, I know how to do that, or others you don't. I have to say that when I first started thinking about analyzing data from the simulator, which actually started during lockdown and is a practice that I've been doing ever since, it's not necessarily as easy as can be. And there are some resources that are available from AIM to be able to help with this. So I thought I'd just show you a little bit about how I do it, just how we can work through that. The second thing is importing your data from the simulator into Race Studio 3 analysis. Now, I will show you a little bit of the way of being able to, how you do it in the older Race Studio 2, but more than anything else today, we're going to focus all of our conversation on the latest software because it's arguably the most powerful software to be able to help you analyze your data. One of the things that I do think is interesting is that there is no clear sort of leading software available for simulator in relation to analysis, but you can use many different varieties in market. The beauty of the AIM software is that it's free. Anyone can use it. You don't have to have an AIM device to be able to use it, and it just gives you an opportunity to be able to practice and work with that data. Then we're going to get into setting up a profile. Now, I'm going to do some aspects of the profile setup relatively quickly, because in many respects, we've covered this in previous webinars, but I think it's important as to we figure out how to be able to set up a profile for simulator data. And then more importantly, number 4 here is we're going to start looking at how do I set up a profile where I align real life data with simulator data and see what that looks like. And then the last thing we're going to do is some data analysis of an in real life example plus a simulator example as well. So that's going to be the topic. Now, as we go through this, and don't worry, there's not going to be endless PowerPoints through this. I will do a lot of demos and pictures and things, I promise. But I thought I'd write down all of the reasons why I'm finding the benefits of analyzing sim racing data. Because oftentimes it doesn't seem like really something that's there. Oftentimes we think about simulator as a way of being able to have some fun. Maybe we're racing online with friends. We're, using it as a way of being able to, distract ourselves. It's a fun thing to be able to do. But one of the things that I've identified is that it is a fantastic way of being able to access data to analyze at any given time. Now, many of us, and I'm sure many of you who are either watching this or attending this webinar, have access to a simulator where you can get that data and you can look at that sort of information. Now, the beauty of it is that it is super cost-effective way to get to data. You don't have to get to the track, be limited to 2 or 3 sessions, and then you may go back in a few weeks or a few months to be able to get that. All it is just turning on a computer. You can access the data and get the information that you need. The next thing, which is also fascinating, is you have every possible data channel you want to work with. any of us who may be in a scenario where we've started to add channels to our analysis because we've got them available in our cars. They might be available through the ECU connection on your car. They might be available through channels. And if you want to be able to get a good grasp on what's happening with channels and setup, we've done webinars in the past where we look at analog inputs and ECU inputs, and there's a lot of information there. So go through the archive of the AIM Academy and you'll find some interesting information there. Now, what is fascinating here is that from every aspect of suspension setup to elements of braking, steering, throttle application, every single channel that you may want to be able to work with is available at any given time through sim racing. So much so, one of the things I'm going to show you today is how do I limit the amount of data that I download so that analysis becomes easier to be able to work with, because it does create quite sizable files in terms of data. The other thing that I absolutely love is the immediate application of key learnings that you've looked at. And so I'm one of those who does the session, looks at the data, finds things to work on, and then goes back. Now, in a real life race car, that's great. You get a few sessions in the day, but things change a lot. It may be raining, especially here in the UK. It hasn't actually stopped raining since October. But in many respects, you might get a dry session, then a wet session, and everything you've just started to work on maybe null and void. Whereas when you think about simulator racing and simulator data, you can set that up however you see fit. So there's some really interesting things to be able to work through from that aspect as well. Then we've got testing setups. There's a really, really good webinar on the AIM Sports, which is the US AIM environment, where you can there's some really good, and a gentleman by the name of Ray Phillips talks about varying his setups, I think on an MX-5 or a Miata, depending on where you're from, is what it's called, where he tests different spectrums of setup in terms of suspension to be able to see how the car behaves. It's really quite enjoyable to be able to mess with the settings on a simulator car just to see what it does. And sometimes it's absolutely terrifying, and other times it's hilarious as to where you find that comfortable balance, but it's something you can work with. Then we get into the application of things that are useful. I found more than anything else, because it's the same track that you'll be racing in the simulator that you will in real life, you can start to set things up that may be applicable. For example, in the last webinar we did a month ago, we talked about setting up maps, and we set up maps with segments to be able to work on different aspects. We had one that was associated with braking. We had one that was associated with corner analysis, with creating segments. And when we think about it from that point of view, you can get all this done ahead of time before you get to the track so that you can really get into the analysis when you're there in that short period of time, especially if in many instances, we don't have a huge amount of time at the track because we get distracted by absolutely everything that's going on. And then the last thing is this wonderful practice for data analysis. And it's something that, this is a skill and an art form that, we need to develop over time. And so I find that to be a very enjoyable thing. So that's really the benefits of using this. And I know I've sort of belabored this point a little bit, but I want to start getting into how do we access this and how we use this. So let's have a look at that. Now, I'm going to use iRacing as an example, but don't worry if you're somebody who uses something like Assetto Corsa, there are instructions in all these particular areas. But because I'm an iRacing user, I'm going to use that as the example to be able to set up. Because the first thing, and one of the videos that I put on my own channel a little while ago, which is probably one of the most popular videos about sim racing, is how do I go about logging the simulating data in the first place? And you can get this so it's switched on by default. But in many respects, the most important thing is to know how to turn the simulator on and off in terms of logging telemetry. So what I've done here is I have, so apparently my camera is good, but if my voice is still good, we'll keep going on that front and I'll check out the camera in just a minute. Please let me know if my voice stops working as well, and we'll go through that as well. So in many respects, in this instance, what we've got is we've got a scenario where we need to know how to turn on and off our telemetry. And in that instance, one of the things I think is really important is, and thank you for everyone letting me know the voice is going well. You don't need to see my happy face all of the time, and I'll see if I can fix that camera in just a minute as we transition. But in many respects, it's really quite interesting, and it's a shame the camera's not working because I wanted to show and hold something up to be able to show you something that I use. But either way, if we're used to using iRacing, we're used to using simulators, we also know that we have to be able to map certain buttons on our particular controller. On my steering wheel, I have a button that turns telemetry on and off. And interestingly, over time, they've also added this extra component, which is mark an event in the telemetry, which I never knew existed until I heard an interview with Lewis Hamilton, who said he's got a button on the steering wheel that logs every time the car does something that he doesn't like oversteer moment and understeer moment, which pinpoints his focus as to where he puts his attention in the data when he looks at a later point. And you can map that on the actual steering wheel that you use. Once you've mapped it, to know that it's working, what you'll see, and you'll see this in different instances on different devices, but typically, and I did put a big red arrow here just to be able to point out where it is, not sure why I've made it quite so big, is that you will also see something that's really important. So here you can see there's this button here that says telemetry. If you're using the device, you can toggle that on and off, but if it's on, it will be recording telemetry for that particular session. Now, this is great right now. It's not ready for analysis yet. It's just logging this information. But in many respects, it's very important for us to be able to use that to know just how that's working as part of this overall scenario. So know and look out for this if you're using, and know which particular device and software turns yours on and off. But I think that's important because once you've started logging the data, you'll start keeping a record or a session, just like you would if you wanted to download a file from your Solo 2 or your Evo 4S, whatever it may be. And that's the last part of this discussion, which is where does it sit on my computer? So when we think about it, it's not on a device, it's logged somewhere in the computer. So this is an example of where all my iRacing files are as part of my overall sort of documentation. And you can see that sitting in my documents in the iRacing folder, there is an area here called telemetry. This is where all your data gets logged as the sessions that you've done. So now you've got iRacing, and Acertic also does it, Race Factor 2 does it. They all do the ability for you to be able to log that particular piece of information to be able to gather that. And I think it's important to know where this is, just for many of you who are watching this who don't know necessarily where to look. So that's the thing that I wanted to be able to show on here. And I'm going to switch to doing a demonstration now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and see if I can get my camera to behave. Let me see if I turn that on and turn it off again, see if I can get that to switch itself back on. Just hoping that hasn't actually just stopped me actually broadcasting at the same time. If it has, that's a real nuisance. And I'll need to get a camera. This is what's happening here. Can you still hear my voice, just out of interest? All good still, which is lovely. Thank you for that. And whether this camera is going to... Oh, there we are. Look, I'm back again, which is good. By the way, just to be able to show everyone before we get going again, was that this is my steering wheel. Let me just turn off the delightful zoom blur just for a second. You also see my race wheel in the background, which is right there. So this is where I live. But in many respects, this is the wheel. I mapped this button here, which got a nice little picture of telemetry, and I just press that on and off. And that's what turns on the telemetry on my device, so I can make sure that it's recording. Now, mine comes on by default, but if it doesn't, just know how to turn on your data, which is really important to be able to know what to do. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to switch to a live demo, and we're going to get into some of the aspects of being able to use the sim data in our software. So we've gone back to this, which is what I'm potentially sharing. I'm going to turn this off. So I'm off of the presentation, and I'm going to go straight to Race Studio 3 analysis. Or not, I'm actually going to go to Race Studio 3. This is what we all see. This is what we've seen for years now. I think since almost 2014, this is the view that many of us have seen in terms of using our data. And one of the things that's evolved over time is the ability to be able to do more with different aspects of this particular software. Now, one of the things we just mentioned earlier is that we need to be able to convert the data from the simulator into data that can be read in Race Studio 3 analysis. Now, there are two ways of doing this. This first way I'm going to show you allows you to be able to use this data not only in Race Studio 3, but also Race Studio 2 analysis. And that is by clicking up here in this little area here, and there's a menu here that allows you to be able to see different areas. Now, we're not going to focus on this one today. Interestingly, if you click on here, this is actually quite a misleading button. What this does is it actually sets up the ability for the computer to send via the simulator all of the channels from iRacing into an actual dash. So on my setup, I actually have an AIM dash, which allows me to practice the configuration of displays and setups and those sort of aspects. And that's conversation for a different day. If anyone's interested in that, always raise your hand in terms of something you'd like to learn. But what we want to be able to focus on today is something called conversion of files. Now, this is where you convert your files from what's available in iRacing into something that you can actually use in Race Studio 3 analysis. Now, you have a few options here, but let's go into settings first to be able to see what's happening, because I think it's important we do this just so you know a few variables that are here. Now, the first thing that's important is for iRacing, I've specified where my data is housed. Typically here, it will actually say telemetry, but I've changed mine to the iRacing import because I've created a folder that's separate that doesn't list every single session that I do, because I do a lot of sessions on my simulator and I don't necessarily want to analyze every file. So typically, if I want to analyze the file that I want to be able to look at, I pull it out of the telemetry file and I drop it into this import box. It means that it just simplifies the process and I focus on what I want to be able to work on. The next is we have the option of being able to say, where do we want to put that data in Race Studio 2 analysis or Race Studio 3? In this particular example, I'm going to leave it at Race Studio 2. For any of you who are still comfortable with the old software, I just wanted to show you this, although today's focus will be mostly on Race Studio 3 analysis. But the box I want to be able to focus on is this button that says all channels. Now, if anyone's ever used iRacing and had a look at a telemetry file, you will know that there are many, many channels. And when I say many channels, I'm talking, it feels like hundreds now. It's probably not quite that many, but if you think about downloading data from something like an AIM Solo 2, you have probably 10 that are available. What we're talking about here is the opportunity of being able to download every single data channel that's there. Or you can download a smaller subset of channels that allows you just to be able to get the core basics of the channels that you need to be able to analyze and not everything else. If you're interested in what that looks like, you can actually go, and we'll make sure this is linked in the YouTube box below if anyone watches this later, that shows you what's available in different streams. So this is available in AIM Technologies. It's also available in many different locations as well from AIM. But you can see in each of those particular programs, you have a basic set and an advanced set. And as you scroll down, you can see iRacing here, for example, which is the one that I'm using, has all of these channels that you want to be able to have a look at. The ones that ordinarily in your car, you probably would say, well, God, I'd love to have those in my everyday race car, let alone all of these extra advanced channels that tells you what's happening with the wear on the left, left wheel, for example, or tire, the temperatures, the shock, the ride heights, whatever you be looking at here, you do get an awful lot of additional data that you need to. So you have to decide which ones of these you want. So we'll make sure this is linked. But as you go back here, you've got the option. If it's ticked, you get absolutely everything. If it's not ticked, you just get that basic set, which makes life a little bit easier. So once you've done this and you've got this all set up, the next thing you can do is convert the files. Now you have an option of being able to just convert a file, which it will do for you, available for import. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on batch convert because it's a nice way of being able to see what you're going to get. Now, in this particular scenario, you may be able to set up this analysis for sort of different types of data. So one of the ones that I particularly like being able to do is if I click on this one, this gives me the information for Race Studio 2. If I had Race Studio 3 ticked, it would also have that there. Similarly, I can also click on Google. I could merge into a single file. Now, you may be wondering, why did I click on Google? Well, if you remember from the old software, you would have been able to upload these laps into Google Earth and be able to see how your laps did on Google Earth. And for best part of the last 5 years, that has been in the top 3 videos that anyone has ever watched on my channel of people wanting to see their videos, their laps overlaid on Google. You can do the same thing with the data from iRacing, which I think is fantastic. But the reason I'm showing you in Race Studio 3 analysis today is that it's all done automatically for you. Once you've done that, you can then go in and select either a folder to do a batch conversion, or you can select a file. If you remember, I've got that iRacing import. I've got this one from Brands Hatch here. I can just click on open, and then I click on convert, and it's going to convert that file, and it's going to make it ready for me to be able to import directly into Race Studio 2 analysis. and it's the way the process is done. We could have done this with Race Studio 3 as well. You can see there it is showing up on the screen. These are the additional files it's just created, and that's all ready to be able to analyze directly from that data file that you just logged in your simulator. So again, it's nice to be able to have all of this information. However, we want to be able to go a little bit further than that. And so today's analysis, I'm going to exit out of this, is to look at Race Studio 3. Now, hopefully everyone who's on this webinar has used or is using Race Studio 3 analysis as their default now, because interestingly enough, it has actually been in main production now for at least a year, and many of us have been using the beta for a couple of years now. So it should be the mainstay of everything that we do, and I have to say, seeing a lot more usage of this at the track. As we know, to be able to get to it, we click here, and one of the things that we can see is all of our sessions that are listed here. If I've imported data from iRacing, I also get a nice little icon plus an indicator here of that data. Now that'll be that'll be useful. Terrible at these webinars sometimes, I apologize. That'll be very useful for a later date. What we want to do right now is we want to be able to bring our data into the system. So when I said it was easier in Race Studio 3 analysis, I wasn't joking. It is so much easier. If you click here and you click on the import button and you import files, if I go back to that iRacing import and I find the IBT file, which is the file that you get from iRacing, always remember the .ibt. It's funny, it's like a Word document is .doc, an Excel document is .xls. A iRacing file with telemetry, I don't know what the B stands for, but I'm guessing I is iRacing and T is telemetry, is there. So I've selected that. If, for example, I wanted to import the one I converted, I can use that one, but I don't. I want this one because this is just the raw data. All I need to do here is click on open and the system does it for you. And I don't need to do any of that conversion. I don't need to do any of that adjustment. Now, what is interesting is that when you do it this way, you get every single channel. So if you're somebody who's like, oh, wow, how many channels did I just get? You may want to go back to that other way of converting the file and getting the smaller set. But for me, I don't care. I know what channels I want. I know what I want to be able to work with. That process has happened. And so you can now see that iRacing Brands Hatch Indy file is right here and is available in this particular channel for me to be able to start analyzing. So that's it. We've got the data into the system right now. And the next thing we need to do is to start thinking about setting up a profile to be able to start analyzing data. Now, this is no different to anything that we may have done before. This is no different to any other kind of data analysis. Now, there may be some elements of cleanup that we need to do, because if any of you are iRacing users, just like I am, there may be moments when you may find a scenario where you may have gone off track a few hundred times, or you may have spun, or you may have ended your session halfway through. And you do see that. If I sort this by laps, for example, you can see that there are moments when you're looking at a lap time. Now, a lap time at Silverstone should be around about 50 seconds. This one here suggests that I did it in 47 seconds, but I don't think that that lap is complete. And so we need to think about going in and cleaning up a little bit. And that's one of the downsides of being able to use simulator racing data. There is a little bit more cleanup than there is in real life, because chances are in real life, you don't sort of go as all out as you may do in the simulator. Some of you may do, and you may have sessions and laps that are this long, but it may take a bit of cleanup. But to be able to do that, what we're going to do is we're actually going to open up different aspects. In fact, I'm going to open up this file to start off with, just to be able to show you what we downloaded from the track. Now, I've got a few sessions that are open here, and I'm not going to actually use that. I'm going to use a different one because that didn't have everything I wanted. And I'm going to go back to Silverstone, where I've been doing some laps recently. And these are the laps that I want to be able to use to be able to compare. You can see that I actually got slightly better here and started to be more consistent in my lap times, which was quite nice in terms of being able to look here. Now, one of the things that I will also sort of caveat is my initial reaction will be, how close is this to my real life racing, and am I anywhere near? Well, it says here I did a 102.3, and that's faster than I've ever been in real life, but by how much is actually not that far off. If I click here, my own personal best the last time I was there was a 103.1. And what's also, if I go back up here and I look at some of these laps, as we get into it, one of the things you're going to notice is that my reckless abandon with track limits would have had half of these laps actually deleted. And so I need to be able to figure out where I can find that connection together. But we're going to look at the data first, just to be able to make sure that we're analyzing the right data. So I'm going to open it up, and you're going to see a simple sort of view, or a similar view that we usually see as we open up any kind of analysis, which is we're going to see my usual favorites: a time distance, a track map, and a split times. Those are the ones, if anyone's ever watched any of my videos for Aim Shop or for my own personal ones or ones I've done with the folks in the US, those are called sort of like the holy trinity of a sort of reports that will give you nearly everything you need for driver analysis that works with every single device. We may add a bit more today, but we're going to focus a lot on these. The other thing you may also notice is we've got the definitions of the track in terms of different areas based upon what I have put in place in previous times for track maps. And remember, it's the same place geographically on the track map. You can see it right here. I've just loaded up a simulator. But if you've ever watched my sessions before, this looks exactly like it would do, with the exception maybe of how wide I seem to be going here in Cox, which is why I was talking about being able to make sure that we're clear on analysis lap to lap. Now, before we do this, we want to be able to set this up in a way. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to turn all of these off. No, I don't want to close that actually. I want to keep it open, but I want to start again. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click that I want to save the profile as, and I'm going to call this the AIM webinar profile, because we're going to build on this as we start adding in real and simulated data. So I'm going to click on OK. And so the first thing we want to be able to set up is potentially a time distance layout. So if I click here, we're going to have that typical view. Now it's gone back to the one that I usually set up, and that's fine. But basically, you're going to have a series of options just like you would do normally. However, the one thing that's very different to anyone who's using any AIM device, and I don't necessarily care how many channels you have, I would suspect you really don't have this many data channels to be able to work through, to be able to do your analysis. It is really interesting how many you have that are here. But as you start thinking about analysis, you can start looking at this, because this is beautiful for not only driver input, but you can also look at what's happening in terms of vehicle dynamics to be able to start setting up your vehicle health profiles or your chassis development profiles. And if you remember things that I've always talked about, and they're available from other webinars, I'm doing a lot of backwards reference today, is that I believe that you want to set up a profile for three key areas. One is developing the driver. One is understanding the health of the car, just in case something needs to be addressed. And the third is being able to make sure that you're using data to be able to effectively set up the chassis so it drives better, and that could be set up. And there's an interesting intersection of all of them together to be able to make sure that you have that perfect view of what's happening from the data you have. All of this is available to you from your particular setup. Now, many of you may be saying, well, you know, I'm used to just using GPS data. Well, interestingly enough, one of the things we could do if we wanted to make this a little bit simpler is we could just get rid of all these. We can keep GPS speed in here. Remember, I'm still only using iRacing. I'm not using anything from actual device. I can put GPS in here to be able to find it. I can turn on longitudinal acceleration. And all of a sudden, I now have a view which I may be very comfortable with analyzing the data that I would do in offline to online, or online to offline, depending on how you think about it. And I don't even know if you should call it offline. Seems a bit weird. So that's the first thing. And the next thing is to then start thinking about analyzing laps. And so as we would do, we could say the top 3 laps, and we can start looking at the consistency of the driver. Same thing exists here. You can double click, look here. I can see my performance by lap, all sorts of stuff. Again, so similar to what we're doing beforehand. If I then turn on the track map, the same thing applies again. I can start seeing all of that analysis that is here, and I can start scrolling through and looking at each of the particular lap times that I'm looking at. And again, we've set this up in the past to be able to work through. And then the last thing I want to be able to set up as well, for example, is the split times report. So again, same thing is applying. I can see what my theoretical best lap would have been, if 1015. We can also see what the performance is through each of these corners. Now, this is where it does get very interesting. If we look at and have a little zoom in here, for example, maybe a little spin or two here, getting a bit carried away. But what is interesting as we scroll through, we may want to be able to find a lap that is actually within track limits that is here. And while iRacing and Assetto Corsa Race Factor will always tell you that lap's going to be deleted because you went off track. Interestingly, when the data comes over in AIM, you have to be aware of which laps were good and which weren't. Otherwise, you could be analyzing data which is not really as accurate as it needs to be. And if you were truly doing a race in iRacing or something like that, you would probably be disqualified, or you would have the miserable slowdown warning based upon the fact that you cut the corner or whatever need be. So you've got to be comfortable with how to be able to look at this. But that's the program. That's all set up, and you've got all that information to be able to analyze at any given time whenever you want, which is not necessarily a bad thing to be able to work through. So if I click on Save This Profile Now, I can save this and use this anytime I like in terms of any variable going forward. Now, this is where we want to start getting into the meat of today's conversation, which is, how do I use this with data from a real life scenario as well? And this is where it gets really important to be able to make sure that you know how to set up profiles, because the data is not going to be same. It's not going to be the same, I should say, from both of them. So you've got to be very comfortable with how to set these up. To do that, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to add a second channel. So right now I have this open here from Silverstone, and I want to find a real life one. So I'm going to go down here and I'm going to open this one up, and that session is going to open up as well. Now, what's interesting is that right now I've got two different profiles that are loaded on top of each other. You can see that interestingly, I said the same car, and I think anyone who drives a Ray would be upset that I'm comparing it to a Van Diemen, and anyone driving it on a Van Diemen would be upset that I'm comparing it to a Ray. It's not the make of the chassis, it's the actual car itself. And so I think in many respects, because we see such an interesting mix-up of Spectrums and Rays and Van Diemen's always in the races, they're so similar in terms of the formula that it's, near as makes no difference enough to be able to get a good analysis of the driver's performance. And I think that there is less of a variance than there would be, say, for example, between the Williams and the Red Bull, if we're talking Formula One. They're relatively close, as we see in the racing. So I did say identical car, but not quite there, but enough to be able to draw analysis. Now, the first thing you've noticed here is that I've got some additional channels that are showing up, and those are the channels that are coming in from the Formula Ford. So I've got two options. The first is that I can get rid of these and make life a lot easier to have consistency. So if I get rid of those, now, for example, I got rid of GPS speed like I shouldn't have done. I'm going to go laps, and I'm going to see best lap from each. Now, all of a sudden, what you're looking at on screen is the difference between a real life lap at Silverstone National and a simulator lap at Silverstone National. Now, earlier on today, I also knew that if I went into the laps, I knew that the 102.3 was probably not a good lap, and it wasn't a permissible lap. What I also knew was through a bit of analysis that this one was much closer to being a realistic lap. So I'm going to turn this one off, leave this one on. I'm going to color it in red just to make the life different in terms of two. In fact, I don't know if that's the right one I've actually chosen in terms of performance going through there. But in many respects, what you can start seeing is before we do absolutely anything here, and I haven't had to set up a complicated profile. If you're somebody who's got an AIM Solo 2, you don't have any more data in your offline world, even if you have 70, 80 channels in iRacing, what I've been able to do right here for everyone on this call today is to be able to say, look, I've been able to overlay the two laps together, and I've been able to see the difference between the two. And you can see that there are some really interesting differences between the two as we look at this particular sort of lap. Now, as many of you will probably be aware, there are certain aspects with the fact that if I go back to the channels, the blue is the real life and the red is the not so real life. And I can now start scrolling in and seeing what I did that is here. Again, the red lap is actually a poor lap. See how I went off track again. I was really trying to work on how much speed I could carry through cops, which is a great example of exactly what I was trying to do and exactly what I was trying to work on without the fear of death. Now, it's funny, I say fear of death, and I'm a racer who's a very cautious racer, which many of you may have seen in the data you've looked at before. But the way I sort of plan things out is I slowly have to work up to things as I'm at a track. I might find a corner that has a lot of runoff, and I'll start working on that first to get confident with how the car's performing so that I can get to another part of the track where there may be no runoff. and I'm not going to put the car or myself in a tricky position that may require a repair, or a corner might be taken off or something like that. So it's interesting as we look at that. Whereas when I'm in the simulator, it's a very different type of dynamic for me. It's something that I work on, and maybe that's a bad habit that I need to be able to work on. But as we go through, we can start looking at different sorts of aspects of the laps. I don't actually like that one to be able to analyze, so maybe we take this one instead and turn this one off to be able to see what that looks like, which is a little bit more accurate, but at the same time, there are still areas to be able to focus on. But you can see that there are certain key aspects of this which are interesting as you want to be able to analyze it, that, this is obviously did something crazy here. Let's scroll in and see what happened. And you can see again, I overcharged and overshot that corner as much as I could do, overslowed. And as a result, you could see that I had to brake pretty hard to be able to get the car to stop. Again, something which, we're seeing in the GPS data, but we can start analyzing sort of session to session. Now, before we get into too much data analysis, I wanted to be able to take it one step forward with the profile, because here's where it gets really sort of interesting. I can actually analyze driver inputs beyond necessarily just GPS, from simulator to real life, but it requires a different sort of focus. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to the channels, and I'm going to start adding in channels that I would ordinarily use if I were using my own race car. So I'm going to first start with the Van Diemen. This is my car. This isn't the stuff that was done in simulator, so it's blue. And if I wanted to be able to add in different variables here. So if I, for example, I'm just going to make those sort of stacked on top of each other right now. If I, for example, wanted to be able to see my steering angle, if I wanted to be able to see my throttle, sorry, I should have done this earlier. Like this is just with a small set of lists. Imagine what would happen if I wanted throttle, if I want brake pressure at the front. So certain things that are here that I want to be able to have a look at beyond necessarily there. And you can see right now that this has said, well, they're not necessarily available and they're not on screen from the race. So if I click here and go here, I've gone to the other one, and I can start finding additional things. I actually might add RPM as well, because that might get quite interesting from that point of view too. So I turned off speed. Let's add in RPM. Go back here, I can add in RPMs. So that's RPMs on both, which is great. So now you can see I've got GPS speed, I've got RPMs. That's pretty similar, that is there. But we're going to start getting into some tricky spots in a minute as we start looking at brake. So I'm going to actually type in the word brake here to find it in the million list of ones that are available. So I've added in brake, that's down there. I'm also going to add in throttle. And why I'm doing it this way is what I'm actually also trying to show is the speed and ease of finding channels in Race Studio 3 analysis. One of the things in Race Studio 2 analysis was scrolling down that list, endlessly trying to find your particular setup. This has made life a little bit easier. But one of the things you'll notice is that where the channels don't necessarily have the same name, they don't sit on top of each other. Now, I've done this on purpose as part of today's sort of discussion to be able to show you how we want to be able to work through those particular discrepancies. Because where we have speed and RPM, they're named the same thing in simulator and they're named the same thing in real life. And so they've overlaid on top of each other. But then throttle here is called throttle here, and brake here is called brake here. And so how do I fix that so I can see that information overlaid on top of each other? To make life easier, I'm actually going to get rid of steering on this one, because that just adds just one too many channels to look at. So we want to simplify these two here. To do this, we have to go to a feature that allows you to be able to specify what type of tiles you want to be able to have. So if I click here and I go to the channels, I'm going to be in a position where I'm going to be able to see the channels as they appear here. And I'm going to be able to overlay them on top of each other. Don't want that. That tells me nothing. Or I'm going to be able to overlay them with a number. Now, what we want to be looking for, and it's this button here where you can specify is mixed, is you want to be looking for this here. Now, many of you may have seen this before and said, oh, I'm very comfortable with that. But what this is doing is this is allowing you to know which one of the order you want that particular channel to be in. So do I 1, top, 2, middle, 3. But the interesting thing is you don't necessarily have to have just one channel in that number. So if I leave GPS speed as a 1 there, and I go to the red bit and I have a 1 there, they're the same. Great. Let's change RPM to 2. And let's go back up to this one, and that one's also 2. Let's go to the next one, which we may want to be able to see throttle. So let's make that number 3. And one of the things that you'll notice now is that that hasn't changed. But if I go here, if I put throttle position, now I've overlaid the top together. Let's do the same thing here, but let's do it with brake. So brake, we want to be number 4. So we're going to change that one to number 4. I'm actually going to get rid of GPS longitudinal. We don't want it. And I'm going to go back to the formula forward here, and I'm going to change that brake there, which was named differently, but I'm going to change that to number 4. Now what we've done is we have now overlaid on top of each other 2 different named variables. One's from sim, one's from real life, but now we have them available overlaid on top of each other. Now this is where there might be something that the purists may say, amongst us might say, they're not perfectly lined up. Well, they're lined up enough for us to be able to start doing some analysis, because interestingly, as you think about how you have some of your channels set up, you may be in a position whereby, there might be something that's slightly unusual. For example, if I double click here, I can sort these so they're slightly better in terms of overview. I can do the same thing with RPM. I can do the same thing with speed. So that's now a better view, but I can at least start seeing what's happening with the driver input. And not only did I have GPS data, which was the same in both of them, but now I'm using a virtual brake from my simulator setup compared with the brake pedal in my actual car. So now what we can start doing is we can start doing some analysis, and we can start seeing some really interesting information in relation to what am I doing differently. To make sure that we don't lose our place, I'm just going to click on Save Profile. So I've got that set up. And every time I now load this, and I load a session from iRacing and I load a session from real life, as long as the channels are the same in my actual car, and that, let's say, for example, iRacing doesn't change every single variable, which chances are they haven't, and they haven't for a long time. They may add a few, but they haven't actually changed the naming convention. We can now start doing some analysis here and looking at the data as we want to be able to have a look at the laps. And we can start seeing some very interesting different types of information that we can see. So if I were going to analyze this more than anything else, the first thing we can start looking at is, what do I do differently in sim racing that I don't do in real life? And I think the first thing, which is fair to be able to say, and many of you have probably spotted it already, is that I am a lot more, it's the best word to use, cavalier or braver on the brakes. Because that consequence aspect of being able to say, oh my goodness, if I'm late on the brakes here, then, I don't want to have to repair the car or whatever need be. Plus, there's always the fact that I still have, and I don't know how many of you have as well, and I'm always quite an honest racer, I always have a little bit of fear when you're doing 120 miles an hour and you're just trying to brush the brakes to carry the speed through the corner. I will tend to overbrake. And that's exactly what's happening if I wanted to have a look at the first analysis of the first corner. If I were going to start looking at the data compared to each other, what's the difference between my lap time? And you can see in 3 of the heaviest braking areas that exist, the first is Cops, the second is Maggots, and the third is Brooklands. This shouldn't be a heavy braking at all. And interestingly, in real life, one of the things that I tend to do is look how much brake application is being applied. Versus in the simulator scenario, I'm not only braking a little bit later, but I'm braking less to be able to carry that speed through the corner. But where it does get interesting is that now we've got to the other dynamic that I'm working on, which is, okay, I've got to keep practicing working through this because I've charged that corner now. And you can see that despite being able to carry all that speed in, I'm able to get to the throttle a lot sooner here using the real life example, and therefore I carry that speed all the way down to the next straightaway. However, on the next one, I'm actually a lot better in both the braking and the transition. So when you start thinking about the fact of how applicable is sim racing to real life, I can start to understand different aspects of performance. Now, one of the other things that I tried around here as well is I started playing with brake bias to be able to see what happened. I can change brake bias in my real car. I can change brake bias online in the simulator. In fact, interestingly enough, I wish it was as easy in my Formula Ford in real life as it is on the race car. On here, all I need to do is twist one of these little dials here, and it changes the bias. That's sort of very awkward to get to brake valve bias in the car. I can still do it though, but it tells me what's going on as I start looking at that data. Other things which are interesting that we can start identifying here as we look through the data is we can see other sort of variables. My throttle reapplication in simulator is a lot more confident than it is in real life. And so maybe it's for that sort of, okay, well, if I run out of room, does it matter? Potentially that's part of the issue, but you can see that there's a hesitance going to throttle here, but there's an absolute clean application of the throttle. Well, this one's got a little bit of a blip, but coming out of Luffield, you can see that there's a clean application. It's a bit hesitant here and a bit later here. So as I start looking through each of these particular areas, I can start analyzing all sorts of different pieces of information. And I have to say, for me personally, the fact that I can start working on certain key aspects before I get to the track is probably one of the most useful things that I've been able to see from a few different areas. Not only is it simple stuff like, even if you can carry the speed into cops, you can't carry it out, so don't go absolutely nuts on the way in because you can't get out. And I can start practice and I can practice and I can practice that area. But what was also very interesting, and it's sort of related to this, but not, I used a service recently in the US called Blaze. And you upload your data to a professional race driver who within the period of 24, 48 hours sends you back a video analysis of your actual performance. What was interesting, and this is why this is so sort of relevant to what I'm showing you right now, is I sent this 103.1 to the driver who analyzed my data. And the very first thing they said to me was, we've studied cops more than anything else, and you are using way too much brake to go into that corner. You're forcing the car to all the way to the front. It means that you're not able to get the car to turn in properly because effectively you are putting too much weight on the front and inducing understeer. So a lighter brake in there will allow you to carry that speed through. And while I may have messed it up here, every aspect of being able to look at that now is me starting to practice working on the absolute positioning of the car, the gentler brake application, and the carrying the speed through that corner based upon what I learned from my real life data. And that for me, more than anything else, is probably one of the most useful applications. It's the same thing coming out of maggots here. If you look at this particular area here, the ability to be able to brake, turn, and transition quite quickly coming out of there is a lot more. There's a hesitance that I have on the brake pedal here versus a very clean brake and then accelerate. There was a little bubble here, and that could have been something there. It didn't have a huge material impact. But if we look at the analysis of this data, everything I lost going in terms of losing the speed coming out of cops by carrying too much speed, I gained by having a clean transition down the back of the Wellington Straight. And so with that, there are so many things that we can start looking at, but there's a little bit more. And the reason I love a little bit more is it allows us to start looking at some other sort of key aspects. The next thing we can look at is what's the difference in relation to consistency. So we can do the same thing we did previously. And while I don't feel confident necessarily that my track limits were correct in cops as I'm practicing, and you can see just how wild and crazy I was going through there in terms of trying to practice that speed. The interesting thing is in a corner that's much more sort of, similar in many respects. And if I take maggots as a good example, in real life, the fastest I went through there was an 8.4. In the simulator, it was an 8.0. But all of these variables through this particular area of the corner are within an acceptable level of tolerance in terms of difference between simulator and real life racing. So how do I get consistent? What did I do in this particular area that allowed me to get that particular speed and those 0.4 of a second that I haven't been able to get here? And I could dig in and start looking at certain aspects. So I could look at lap 18 and have a look at what I did in lap 18 versus my fastest here, which was an 8.4. It's very easy. We just go back here and say, let's look at if we said it was lap 18, which is, go to laps. Lap 18 here versus lap, I can't remember which lap it was now. I shouldn't be doing this. Sometimes so it was lap 8. So we go back here and we go into lap number 8. And then we turn that one off and we turn that one off. And we have a look at maggots, which is where I was here. And you can see if we want to be able to analyze that, which is if we were comparing this in the Van Diemen versus this in the Ray, the real difference was, being able to carry a bit more speed into that corner, but also get to the throttle sooner coming out. So now I can start looking at, well, what was the line like? So I can start scrolling down here and saying, well, the line was very interesting because I actually sort of really sort of made the corner a bit too shallow here, but on the simulator, I made the lap a lot wider by having a wider entrance in, a later apex, and allowed me to be able to carry the speed out. And interestingly, you can also see that there was actual really good track usage, no track limit issues. And so it allows me to be able to dig into that a little bit more as well. And so there's so much we can see, and I'm always conscious of time and giving an opportunity for questions and answers. But earlier on, the premise was how accurate and how similar are in real life racing laps versus simulator racing. And the moment they put the Formula Ford onto iRacing, I knew it was going to be probably one of the most informative opportunities for me to be able to learn how to drive. I mean, as I look at this now, there's so many things I can analyze, like my brake traces. These are beautiful threshold brakings. That's a nice sort of arc that's there with slightly less, going in. This one's a jaggedy sort of way in. There's not bad brake application here. So you can look at brake application, look at all sorts of stuff. But with that, I'm going to stop because I want to be able to see if there are any questions or thoughts or comments based upon what you've seen today, and whether anyone has any questions they'd like us to answer. Feel free to ask the questions in the chat box as well, which I'll happily read out should you not want to speak in front of everyone. Not that that's weird, it's just, in case you want us to address it with everyone. Good. Sometimes there's no questions, which is kind of cool. Just out of interest, and just a quick poll, more than anything else, maybe put it in the chat box so everyone can see. Out of everyone who's attending today, how many people use a simulator that has this particular data available to them? Just put a yes or a no or something in the chat box so we can actually see. So Diego does, which is great. Don doesn't. Yes, iRacing, not yet. Which is good. So a lot of no's, which is great in a way. Out of interest, is the ability to be able to use iRacing data in a simulator sort of something that you'd consider using, now that you can analyze the data from iRacing for your real life racing, or is it still seen as just sort of like that was a nice to have rather than a must have? A lot of people saying they use iRacing, which is great. And it doesn't matter. We don't need to necessarily discuss through many of these sort of aspects. But what I would say is that I really didn't get into simulator racing hugely until lockdown. And Ashley said that looking at this as an option. So lockdown was the big impetus. And I think iRacing themselves actually had such a huge boost, as did many of the other simulator themselves. For me, the biggest crossover is start being able to look at the practice side. Now, it's interesting because folks like Don, who's on the call, and we had a chat just a week or so ago, will probably expect, now that I've got all this data available, to be a second at least faster the next time we're at Silverstone. So I don't know if that's going to be the case, but it does allow me to be able to start working through this. And again, someone mentioned Friends Simulator, whatever need be. The data that you get from the simulator, even if you're not using your own, can be applicable, can be transferred. It's the same as any other data that is there. So it's just like any data file that can be used, which is good. Well, great. Well, we're coming up on time. We are now in the sort of the final throes of our hour together. What we'll make sure happens is when this goes on YouTube for everyone, that we will put the instruction manual so you know how to go and get the data. We will make sure that if needed, this will be available for you to go through slowly. But I think more than anything else, even if you've got an AIM Solo 2, one of the things that is really, really encouraging is the fact that things have improved. A good question from Don here, which is see if lap times improved. Absolutely. I think a follow-up here makes a lot of sense. We talk a lot about analysis, and this is the first time we started looking at some analysis of data, even though it was a short part of today. And so I totally agree. But for me, more than anything else, being able to get coaching from a professional driver to then be able to see if I could apply it in a simulator, to see if I could then apply it in real life, will be something that I want to work over in the next few areas. Could you? But yeah, absolutely. For the questions, for those of you on the call, this will absolutely be uploaded to YouTube. Typically, they go up from the AIM shop folks in the next day or so, 24, 48 hours afterwards, because they have to cut out a lot of me talking at the beginning and the end, because I probably talk too much. But in many respects, yes, it'll all be available on iRacing. Sorry, it will be available on YouTube. Cool. So with that, I will wish everyone an absolutely fantastic rest of your day today, Wednesday. Look out for what we cover off next time. We're actually going to move into some interesting hardware conversations over the next few webinars. We're going to look at the new SmartyCam Dual. We're going to look at setting that up and maybe analyzing the data a little bit. We're also going to start having a look at maybe some of the new steering wheels for Formula drivers and stuff like that as well. We're also going to look at aspects of shock analysis or with actually on motorcycles, which will be good fun. That's not going to be me. I'm going to have a fellow guest speaker. So a lot coming up, so stay tuned. And with that, I'm going to end the webinar and say thanks to everyone for attending today.